Morning, good afternoon, good evening. It depends on where you are in the world. My name is Sharron McPherson. I'm a campusero, and I first of all want to give a big shout out, woohoo, to all my peeps in South Africa. I'm beaming in from Washington, D.C., but I live and I work, and I'm a campusero in South Africa. So shout out to all the folks there. And before I get started, I also wanted to just take this opportunity to give a shout out to all my friends in Brazil. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be there with you. COVID happened, but here we are doing our first ever digital edition of Campus Party. I'm super excited to be here today. I'm not going to spend any time talking about myself because I have a very important message for you. So I'm going to jump in and I'm going to share my screen. So I was really scheduled to talk to you today about, I was scheduled to talk to you today about how we support reimagining learning in Africa. But after participating in Campus Party for the last couple of days, I changed my mind. And I decided that what I really have in my heart to talk to you about today is the art of disrupting education globally. Because as I began to really think and pray about what I needed to say, I really realized that the message that we are bringing to you from South Africa really is a message for how we're going to reboot education globally. So here we go. The way that I have structured my talk today is a 3-act drama. Those of you who know me know I love 3-act dramas. Act 1 is going to be helping you to understand disruption because I want you to be my partner in agreeing to disrupt education globally. Act 2, we're going to talk about why education needs to be disrupted. And then Act 3 is a call to action. I'm going to ask you to join with me and commit to supporting educational initiatives that are committed to transforming education globally. So the Center for Disruptive Tech is one of my day jobs. Like most of you listening, I wear a number of different hats, but I'm an educator. I teach at the University of Cape Town at the Graduate School of Business, and I run something called the Center for Disruptive Tech. We created the Center for Disruptive Tech because we were really interested in helping businesses across all of those industries to really figure out, how does digital transformation work? Digital transformation is a strategy to how you deal with disruption. And so we've developed over 450 case studies globally in partnership with some of the most amazing institutions on the planet. And then I turned my attention to education, in part because I'm an educator. And so Nelson Mandela is just was one of my favorite people on the planet, and not just because he was South African, and that's my adopted country, but just because he was all of that. And he said that education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world today. So that's what we're talking about. In this talk, we're talking about the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world today. And that weapon isn't being used as effectively as it could be. So that's why education matters. I don't need to spend any time today talking about disruption because we're sitting here with this Campus Party Digital Edition because those of us who are passionate about Campus Party decided, hey, listen, our physical in real life version of Campus Party is being disrupted. So what are we going to do? We're going to create the first ever digital edition, and hats off to Campus Party. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. We're taking a big risk by saying we're going to do something. We're going to disrupt ourselves. It's not business as usual, and we are going to do this together. So I feel incredibly blessed to be here with you today. And we know that this disruption that we're experiencing today is not just the pandemic. It's not just COVID-19. We're dealing with globalization, climate change, civil unrest. Yes, Black lives do matter. Population growth, populism, energy, food, and water crisis. These are just some of the things that will continue to disrupt our world. And so part of why Mikkel's talk, which you just had the pleasure of experiencing, was so inspiring to me, because one of the reasons why human beings are so successful is because we can adapt. We're agile, we're resilient. So let's get on with the business of being that in education. So this is a screenshot of a course that we designed, the Center for Disruptive Tech, in partnership with Get Smarter and the Graduate School of Business at Cape Town, at the University of Cape Town, where I teach. And I'm going to share a quick snippet, because the first thing I want to do in Act 1 is debunk a couple of myths about what is disruption, so that you can buy into this whole idea that I am going to be selling to you. So let's do this, and let's talk about disruption. So the idea of
disruption was originally created by Clay Christensen, who's a professor at Harvard University. 15 years ago, he really came up with this idea of disruptive innovation. Now that's important, because we've kind of delinked the concept of disruptive innovation and just have become obsessed with disruption. But let's go back and let's really first understand what were the ideas behind disruptive innovation. So Clay Christensen's theory was basically that there are startup firms that are much smaller than the big incumbents that control a market, that are much better at innovation. And innovation is not the same as ideation. And we'll talk a little bit about that difference. But for now, let's just focus on Clay Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation. And in that theory, the idea was that we should spend some time looking at those firms that are on the outside of the big incumbents, that are innovating in ways that could disrupt value chains, that could disrupt firms in ways that would have an impact on their capacity to grow in the market, to serve the clients, and basically to thrive. And quite often that disruptive innovation wasn't ideation. It wasn't divergent disruption, but it was really incremental. It was really Uber coming along with an app that made hailing a taxi just so much more convenient. Quite often, those firms that were engaged in disruptive innovation actually were not coming up with game-changing ideas. That's ideation. What they were really doing was coming up with small changes, quite often to an existing business model or an idea that just had a little pivot, but that allowed them to grow in a longer trajectory that was very different from the incumbent. But the impact on the incumbent, the firms that were existing in the market before those new, more disruptive innovators came along, would find difficult to deal with, because they're large, they have certain structures, they've been around for a long time, and that's the way we do business around here. In the fourth industrial revolution, business as usual is no business at all, generally.
Bam. Okay, so that is disruption in a nutshell. And I put that little snippet on because we don't have a lot of time. So if you feel like you are drinking from a fire hydrant, that's okay. What is disruption? Why we want to disrupt education, and what you're going to do about it. That's the 3-act drama. This was disruption in a nutshell. And if you're looking at this and you're in some part of the world where perhaps you don't know what Blockbuster was a big incumbent, existed a while ago. Back in 2004, I think Blockbuster had about $6 billion in revenue. Along came Netflix. Next, Netflix disrupted its own business. Imagine trying to sell that to your board of directors, and said, our business isn't really working, so why don't we just try streaming videos? And there you go. By 2016, Netflix has $8 billion in revenue. And so if you're sitting there wondering what this has to do with education, everything. And I want you to take a second, and I want you to ask yourself, do we really want to disrupt education? And if you're saying, then I want you to take your head and do like this. Because we actually do. Do we want it to be bankrupt? No. But do we want it to be transformed? Absolutely. So here's the news flash. COVID-19 came along and really disrupted education. And so at the Center for Disruptive Tech, we were kind of scratching our heads and asking ourselves, like, okay, we have been spending a lot of time thinking about ed tech and thinking about some of the technologies that could really help to transform education. But then COVID came along and schools were closed. And so how does learning continue to happen? We were just hearing an amazing person who was beaming in from Venezuela, where he was struggling with his internet connectivity. Can you imagine what happens in some parts of Africa where, people just don't even have access to stable sources of electricity? How is learning continuing to happen in those homes? And I'm here in the United States, and one of the things that I've realized is that in marginalized communities across America, learning isn't happening right now. And I want you to take a second and think about, how is learning happening in the marginalized communities in the countries where you live, or in the country where you live? Okay, so that was disruptive innovation. That was disruption in a nutshell. And I think we can all agree that education right now, today, is disrupted already. Okay, so now we're into Act Two. Act Two is where I get you to buy in and agree that education should be disrupted. And I'm not just talking about us utilizing this global financial crisis. That was the previous crisis. Shame, I feel so bad for the millennials who are living through all these crises. Now we've got another crisis, COVID-19 crisis. So education is disrupted. And the question is do we want to reform, or do we want to try to build back better? I think we want to try to build back better. So here is a very, very quick overview of how we got to this place where we are today, because most of us don't think of education as an industry. We think of it as a public good, and it is a public good, but it's also big business. All right, so in the beginning, Timbuktu, one of the oldest universities on the planet. I know those of us who are from the West think that, learning was spawned in the bowels of Europe. Nope. Education, really, the kind of education that we've really have had right through the 20th century, really was born in the East. And so that's Timbuktu, one of the oldest universities on the planet. And then in the ancient world, people would travel to sit at the feet of the imams to learn things. And if you will notice, they are all men. Yeah. And the imam would be like, the Oracle of Delphi, and this was the learned person who had all the knowledge, and they would share that knowledge with people who would come from far and wide to study things like algebra, right? Okay, right. And so then what happened in the West was the church got involved during the medieval times. And of course, learning, which was supposed to be fun, became not very much fun. We introduced things like corporal punishment. Yes, we're going to beat kids in school, and we're going to force 6 and 7-year-olds to sit still all day. Is ridiculous, but that's the system that we adapted. And it really began centuries ago. If you notice, these are still a bunch of guys, because education historically has been very male and very elite. Okay. So let's fast forward. I teach at the University of Cape Town. Oh, let's go back. Check this guy. See the guy there sleeping? Funny. Because the more things change, the more they stay the same. Check that guy. That's at my university. We are an equal opportunity offender. I'm sure that's happening at your school too. And students have a right to be bored, because a lot of what they're being exposed to in school is actually not relevant. Yeah, it's not. So now, with hope, you agree that education isn't ripe for reformation. Education needs to be transformed. How are we going to transform education? We're going to transform education by using what we've learned about disruption. Okay, so one of the things that I have learned being in the space as a technologist for the past 10 years. I'm a graduate of the Global Studies program at Singularity University. Shout out to all my friends in Silicon Valley. And one of the reasons why I actually set up the Center for Disruptive Tech was because after I left Singularity University, I wanted to get back to Africa and do cool stuff. So I am an ordinary person who has done some pretty extraordinary things. And I say that because I believe that everyone who is tuning in is capable of doing extraordinary things. And that's important because your voice matters. And yes, you can. And yes, you will. So you're going to partner with us and you're going to commit to figuring out what is your role going to be in helping us to disrupt education so that we can actually create a future where we've moved from education to learning that is socially embedded, that's relevant, where learners have agency. You know, they're responsible for their learning experiences in large part, where it's open wall. Learning can happen anywhere. It doesn't have to only happen in a classroom. That is ridiculous. Clearly, people are learning at home, right? At least some people are learning at home today. All right. So now we're into Act 3. So if you want to disrupt something, and this is relevant not just for education, but what I'm giving you now in this kind of like little mini masterclass is really how could you go about disrupting anything that needs to be disrupted? There's all kinds of ways that we can innovate, and we don't want to just drive, businesses to the ground, but education has to be transformed if we want to change our world. If we want to reboot the world, this is how we're going to do it. Okay, so step 1 is to listen. So in South Africa, during the COVID-19 crisis, members of the Center for Disruptive Tech, we brought together incredible educators, parents, ed tech investors, government representatives, business, and just the whole panoply of stakeholders to say, listen, the gross inequalities that existed before the COVID-19 crisis have just been exposed and exacerbated. And access to learning wasn't equal before COVID-19. We know that. And so what COVID-19, this pandemic, has done, it is just kind of like ripped the bandage off. And now you can really see like the gunk that was under there. And the reason why you don't want to just kind of do some surface stuff and move on is because you really need to get into that and clean it out. You can't use a system of educating people that was quite literally developed centuries ago to try to prepare people to learn in this 21st century that's fraught with complexity, right? That doesn't even make sense, does it? I know it doesn't, but that's what we're doing, right? And so we brought together this working group and we listened. I know that we're all incredibly smart people, capable of doing extraordinary things, but I, as an individual, am never going to be smarter than the 200,000 plus people who are listening to this talk, right? So we are stronger together. Collectively, we are better. So we had to listen first. And when we listened, there were 2 key outcomes that emerged. The first was that we need platforms that better connect the connectors. And so we're going to be investing in what those platforms can look like and exploring. And just like we're doing at Campus Party, we're going to be courageous, right? So courage is when you have fear, but you act anyway. You know that some crazy things can happen and you take a chance. Bravery is when you're not afraid. No, we know that a lot can happen. And we're going to have courage and we're going to step out there and we're going to risk. We're going to put our necks on the line. We're going to take some risk and we're going to ask you to join us. The second thing is that we need more and better permanent funding vehicles. The way that we are approaching educational transformation today almost always relies on the public purse to do that. So you've got the public school system and that's kind of slow and moves like this. And there's a lot of vested interest and there's not a lot of incentive to really transform. And then you got the big business over here, which is going like crazy. and investing in all kinds of very, very cool things. And quite often the people that can really benefit from what's happening in the ed tech space are people who are privileged, who really are already ahead. So what's happening is the divide is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's not sustainable. There is no civilization that has existed in human history that has been able to sustain the gross levels of inequality that we're experiencing on our planet today. So